A very good morning, afternoon, and evening to all the participants of PEI's second open house event on economic inclusion in urban contexts. My name is Marvi Memon, and I'm a former social protection minister from Pakistan and honored to currently be a member of the Advisory Council of the World Bank's Partnership for Economic Inclusion. Let me add, it's an absolute pleasure to be moderating today's open house. And now a bit of basic housekeeping. We're looking forward to hearing all your rich experiences and to having an engaging, interactive session today. So do introduce yourselves in the chat box and start asking your questions to the speakers in the chat box. As always, there is simultaneous interpretation to Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. Please click on the globe icon in the Zoom platform, which is at the bottom of your screen, to change the channel. Additionally, today's event will benefit from the experience of 2 French speakers. So it is very important for those of you who are not French speakers to change to your preferred channel when they do present. And now a little bit about PEI's Open House. The Partnership for Economic Inclusion Open House webinar series gathers global and country experts on strategic thinking around economic inclusion programming and innovations across the globe. As you must be aware, this is our second open house, and this one focuses on the potential for urban economic inclusion programs in building inclusive cities. This open house is organized by PEI and features a rich set of country experiences from A, the World Bank's Social Protection and Jobs Practice, 2, the World Bank's Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land Global Practices, and 3 from Brac, who is PEI's funding and technical partner. We encourage everybody to see our live tweets as this event goes on at PEI-Global_org and to retweet and participate on the social media platforms on this critical subject so an impactful spillover is created. And now, ladies and gentlemen, a very quick word on the agenda. This open house focuses on 2 critical questions. First, how do economic inclusion programs fit within urban policy and planning frameworks? And 2, how does the urban context shape the design and delivery of economic inclusion programs, and how are they different to rural programs? This discussion is timely, as we are all aware of how fast the world is urbanizing, and economic inclusion programs are having to adapt rapidly to addressing issues of urban poverty and the urban jobs challenge, especially in response to COVID-19. Today, globally, over 50% of the population lives in urban areas. By 2045, the urban population will increase to 6 billion. It is imperative for city leadership and development experts to plan for inclusive, sustainable growth, which provides economic inclusion opportunities to the urban inhabitants, including basic services, infrastructure, and affordable housing. About 2/3 of the world's population is expected to live in urban centers by 2050, with nearly 90% of this increase concentrated in Asia and Africa. Cities are the world's centers of political life, and 80% of economic growth is generated from them. The vulnerable suffer the most since they inhabit more hazard-prone zones and have low resilience to shocks. COVID-19 and especially climate change has put the focus back on the urban poverty crisis. Our objective needs to be to build, like I said before, resilient cities to reduce inequalities. By economic inclusion programs, we mean programs that provide a bundle of coordinated, multidimensional interventions that support poor and vulnerable households and communities in increasing their incomes and assets. And a word on urban inclusion. Today's discussion focuses on the role of and adaptations to economic inclusion programs, which are there to build inclusive cities. And finally, before I hand it over to the PEI team for the framing discussion, one last reminder to all of you. Let's see some interaction and let's flood the chat box, please. The first presentation from PEI by Ms. Pooja Datta will share evidence on the current landscape and help frame today's discussion. It draws on the analysis on urban economic inclusion PEI's new In Practice publications series. Over to you, Pooja.
Thank you very much, Marvi. Hello, everyone, and welcome to PEI's second open house on urban economic inclusion. before we dive into all the country experiences and the rich experience there, I'd like to step back a little and give you a little bit of the global perspective so that we can figure out how these country experiences fit with the experience across the world. My name is Pooja Datta. I work with PEI, and this presentation is the result of several months of work with a number of PEI colleagues on looking at economic inclusion programming in urban contexts. And you will see in the next few weeks, this information will be available in PEI's brand new publication series, In Practice. The first question, this whole question of urban economic inclusion is a priority theme for PEI for this year. And the reason for that is fairly understandable. We live in a highly urbanized world. Global urban population is increasing steadily. Already a large proportion of the world's population lives in cities and urban centers. And yet these cities tend to be quite congested, and a large share of the urban population lives in informal settlements and slums. And similarly, we think of urban centers, and they often are engines for economic growth, and they attract people from within the country, across other countries in search of jobs. And yet the number and quality of these jobs tend to be quite limited. And we find that informality in urban areas is very high. And especially youth unemployment is a challenge in many countries across the world. Now, all of these factors were true several years ago. But since 2020, we find that COVID has really thrown into stark relief the vulnerabilities of urban households, as we see their incomes dropping, consumption levels dropping, and food security becoming a challenge for many urban households. So naturally, all of this leads governments to think very seriously about their strategy for the economic inclusion of the urban poor, and the role that these programs, the economic inclusion programs, can play in those strategies. Marvi defined briefly what economic inclusion programs are, but I'd like to spend a minute just on this issue so that we're a very diverse audience at this webinar, and I'd like to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. How PEI thinks of economic inclusion programs is really focusing on two very key characteristics of these programs. One, they focus quite intensively on the extreme poor and vulnerable. And two, because these groups face multiple constraints, these programs do not offer just a single intervention. They offer a multidimensional bundle of coordinated interventions which aim to increase incomes and assets of this target group. The other aspect that PEI really emphasizes is the notion of moving to scale, which is really about not standalone programs, but programs that are deeply embedded in national policy and government investments, in safety nets, in jobs and livelihoods, in financial inclusion strategies. With that as the background, I'd like to also say that for those of us who work in this space, we typically tended to think of these programs as rural. And indeed, when we look at the information that we had in the State of Economic Inclusion report, we find that the majority of these programs do indeed operate in rural areas. But you will also see in the figure on the right that a large share, more than a third, also operate in urban and or peri-urban contexts. This is a large number of programs across the world. And we find that when we dug a little deeper, we found that the main reasons for the emergence of these programs, the policy driver for these programs for governments, tend to be the need to address the urban jobs challenge. But also, from the other side, from the urban planning perspective, is really to move the agenda around inclusive cities. And since 2020, COVID response and recovery has really been a big part of the driver as well for this emergence of programs operating in urban contexts. What's promising is also, what's encouraging is that when we look at the evidence on impact, it is quite promising for this subset of programs that operate in urban contexts, in addition, exclusively or in addition to rural contexts. If you look at the figure on your right, the blue bars indicate the number of studies that report a positive outcome on this broad range of indicators, right, on incomes and revenues, etc. And if we look at the subset of evaluations that focus on programs operating exclusively in urban contexts, What's really encouraging is that we find very promising evidence of impact, specifically on urban residents, in terms of increased income, increased employment, and financial inclusion. So clearly these programs can work even in the urban context. The ministers of finance, though, are interested not just in impact, they also want to know how much do these programs cost. And when we looked at a very small subset of programs that operate in urban contexts, as well as rural, we find that the total cost of these programs actually varies quite a lot, moving from, ranging from $77 to more than almost $1,900 in purchasing power parity terms per beneficiary over the duration of these programs. What we argue, though, it's not the total cost that's the important metric to look at. What's important is what we've highlighted here, an illustration from a program, an urban program in Senegal called the Kum program, which looks at the cost structure. So how do you break down this overall cost into the various components that are delivered to the beneficiaries of these programs, as well as what it costs to deliver these programs, the administration costs. And this is an opportunity for governments to figure out how they could possibly scale up and reduce costs by leveraging existing programs and existing systems. So to sum up this part of the story, we find there are many programs already operating in urban contexts. And what's encouraging is that there is a case to scale up this existing pipeline of programs, and it seems to be happening in the post-COVID world since 2020. But this is a very emerging area for most of us, and there are many open questions that remain with respect both on evidence, but more especially on operational considerations. And one of the key questions that this webinar is going to be looking into is how do you operationalize these questions, these programs in urban contexts, so that they address urban-specific barriers and leverage urban-specific opportunities to economic inclusion for the urban poor. The one thing that we highlight, and you will see in the country presentations, is that it's not enough to simply take a rural program and transplant it directly into urban settings. It's really important to think about what are the specific urban challenges that need to be addressed and where the opportunities may lie that the programs could leverage. Now, as I said before, economic inclusion programs are multidimensional. They offer a package of interventions because they are trying to address the multiple constraints that poor households face. When you think about these constraints at the household or the individual level, there's not really that much difference across location. But when you think of the constraints at the community, local economy, and institutional level, there's quite a lot of variation between rural contexts, peri-urban, and urban contexts. So at the community level, for example, in urban areas, we tend to see very high population density. You see a strain on utilities and access to services can be fraught. Affordable housing is difficult. There's often a fear of eviction for the urban poor. And social cohesion tends to be lower in urban contexts with higher exposure to crime, for example. At the local economy level, however, you see a lot of opportunities. So there's typically a lot more access to markets and opportunities for self-employment, for wage employment, as well as access to financial services and lots of other opportunities in urban areas that tend to be more dynamic economically than rural centers. But at the same time, you have high cost of living, high unemployment rates typically, all of which can be an issue. At the institutional level also, you find that even though urban areas may offer a wide range of programs and services, these may not be, the urban poor may not be able to access these, or these may not be tailored to the needs of this target group. And there's all kinds of other issues that the urban poor may face in terms of regulatory barriers, zoning permits, etc., that affect their livelihoods. So programs, economic inclusion programs that seek to operate in urban contexts need as a starting point to think about these challenges and then think about what are the adaptations necessary to operate in urban centers. We did a review of several programs across the world, and we came up with 4 factors that we saw as the most critical. The first was selecting the target group and really thinking hard about who is eligible and how these people would actually be selected and managed. What kinds of systems could these programs leverage? What new systems might need to be developed? 2, thinking about how to tailor the program design to the needs of the urban poor. So this entails thinking about the objectives and really emphasizing that facilitation of self and wage employment and social inclusion in urban contexts. In terms of design, also thinking about tailoring specific components like training or coaching or wage employment facilitation for the urban poor and for women, particularly amongst them. In urban contexts, there may also be scope to think about shorter duration or a smaller package that is directly provided with a greater emphasis on referrals because there's a greater density of programs and services potentially available. So the program design really needs to be tailored to adjust to the urban context. The third key factor, the third key adaptation is thinking about how delivery systems, particularly for high intensity or group interventions, could be tailored for the lifestyles of the urban poor, maybe thinking about options and the potential for digital delivery. And finally, the fourth adaptation that we focus on is at the institutional level. So going beyond the program and really thinking about how this could leverage and complement spatial investments at the city level and link into urban policy frameworks and work with local urban authorities. All of these things are aspects that we're going to see in the country presentations, which I'm sure you can't wait to get to. And I will leave you with these findings. If you'd like more information, these are the kinds of resources available with PEI. And especially I direct you to our brand new publication in practice publication series, where we'll have 2 notes coming up looking at exactly these issues of economic inclusion programming in urban contexts. And I will leave you with that. Thank you very much and look forward to hearing from the countries. Thank you. Back to you, Marvi.
Okay, thank you very much, Pooja. And now, ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce the speakers for today, a very quick Zoom pre-poll that we encourage you to participate in. Pooja, are we ready for the Zoom pre-poll? We are. Okay, so the Zoom pre-poll is as follows. The question is, what is the most challenging aspect of designing and delivering urban programs that you have experienced or anticipate? Choose as many that apply. First, targeting poor and vulnerable households. The second, supporting a transient population. Third, dealing with low take-up or high program dropouts. 4, identifying viable market opportunities for sustainable urban livelihoods. 5, facilitating access to wage jobs. 6, providing access to applicable financial services. 7, integrating coaching that meets the needs and lifestyles of urban households. 8, tailoring training content and delivery to urban participants. 9, ensuring access to basic services such as sanitation, water, and housing. And finally, 10, leveraging urban local development plans. And can we see the results now? I think we can. So the results are as follows. The top 3, let me see. We have at 63% supporting a transient population. We have at 50 targeting poor and vulnerable households. And we also have a joint 50 integrating coaching that meets the needs and lifestyle. So that's what the poll has said. And now, if I may go on straight to a quick summary of the presentations that you will be listening to today. We have the opportunity today to learn from 3 diverse country experiences on adapting design and delivery to meet the needs of the urban poor and to build effective institutional arrangements. In Benin and Bangladesh, we will hear about government and non-government-led programs for the urban poor, especially youth and women. In Djibouti, we will hear from urban planners' perspective on how economic inclusion programs can advance the agenda around inclusive cities, combining people and place investments. A quick reminder for English-speaking audiences to turn on the French translation as the next speaker will be presenting in French. Let me invite our first distinguished speaker from Benin, Wilfried Djibouti, Technical Secretary for the Coordination of PRODISH, who will be presenting on evidence and operational insights from an urban economic inclusion program in Benin. Over to you.
Oui, merci. Oui, on m'appelle Wilfried Djibouti. Allô? Vous me recevez?
Oui, on peut vous entendre, monsieur.
OK. Donc, on m'appelle Wilfried Djibouti. Je suis le secrétaire technique du PRODIGE. Je suis chargé de vous présenter l'expérience du Bénin en matière d'inclusion des jeunes. Ma présentation sera articulée autour de 3 points. Slide suivant, s'il vous plaît. Le premier point de ma présentation portera sur la phase pilote de mise en œuvre sous le projet emploi des jeunes en matière d'inclusion des jeunes. Le second point sera articulé sur la phase de généralisation en cours de mise en œuvre au niveau du projet d'inclusion des jeunes. Le troisième point se portera sur les engagements pris auprès des autorités locales. Par rapport à la problématique du projet, elle est beaucoup plus axée sur le sous-emploi, étant donné que le sous-emploi est beaucoup plus prépondérant au Bénin et dans plusieurs pays de la sous-région, au niveau des jeunes, mais également au niveau des femmes. La question du chômage n'est pas une réalité vécue dans la plupart de nos pays. Et 3 causes essentielles ont été identifiées par rapport à ce sous-emploi. Et c'est en rapport avec ces 3 causes que les composantes du projet emploi des jeunes ont été dimensionnées. Les causes sont essentiellement liées au problème d'adéquation de compétences professionnelles par rapport aux besoins du marché du travail, au problème de volonté et de capacité à entreprendre au niveau des jeunes, mais également les problèmes liés à l'accès au financement au niveau des jeunes. Le projet met l'accent sur les jeunes vulnérables. Il s'agit essentiellement des jeunes qui ont été à l'école ou bien les jeunes qui sont sortis précocement du système éducatif. Une discrimination positive est mise en place pour pouvoir avoir 50% de femmes. Mais comment la prise en compte des femmes a été assurée dans le cadre du projet? Le slide suivant présente les éléments. Slide suivant, s'il vous plaît. Par rapport au mécanisme mis en place pour pouvoir garantir la participation des femmes, une discrimination positive a été mise en œuvre dans le cadre de la sensibilisation, l'enregistrement et la sélection des bénéficiaires pour pouvoir avoir 50% de bénéficiaires femmes. Il faut dire qu'un programme spécial de formation et d'appui à l'insertion des jeunes filles dans les métiers traditionnellement masculins a été mis en œuvre avec succès. L'autre chose, c'est que les formations en compétences de vie ont mis l'accent sur les aspects genre, ce qui a permis de renforcer la confiance en soi des filles. L'autre élément, c'est que des actions genre ont été mises en œuvre et ces actions ont porté sur la fourniture de services de garde d'enfants aux bénéficiaires femmes et l'ajustement des périodes de formation pour pouvoir tenir compte des périodes de tâches domestiques au niveau des bénéficiaires. Par rapport aux résultats obtenus, les objectifs du projet ont été atteints en quantité et en qualité, ce qui a été évalué à travers une évaluation d'impact dont les résultats sont présentés dans la slide suivante. Slide suivante, s'il vous plaît. Cette évaluation d'impact a permis de donner des résultats importants au niveau de la formation en entrepreneuriat et la formation en compétences de vie. Cette formation a permis d'avoir des résultats importants en termes d'amélioration du profit et des revenus des bénéficiaires. Mais lorsque la formation est couplée avec la subvention, on note une amélioration du capital d'entreprise, une amélioration de la capacité à embaucher au niveau des femmes, une amélioration du profit des femmes par rapport aux hommes, mais il faut noter également une augmentation des ventes à crédit et des coûts salariaux au niveau des femmes, ce qui a posé un peu de problème au niveau de la profitabilité des exploitations tenues par les femmes. Ces résultats ont été capitalisés pour la mise en place d'un nouveau dispositif dans le cadre du nouveau projet qu'on a appelé le dispositif AZOLI, à savoir le chemin de l'emploi. Ce chemin est présenté dans la slide qui suit. Slide qui suit, s'il vous plaît. Dans cette slide, on voit clairement les actions qui ont été mises en œuvre par le PEI en orange. Les améliorations proposées sont présentées en noir et en termes d'amélioration, les améliorations proposées sont présentées dans la slide qui suit. Ces améliorations, la slide qui suit, s'il vous plaît, ces améliorations portent sur le fait que le dispositif AZOLI, tel que conçu, est un dispositif aujourd'hui permanent au profit des jeunes vulnérables. Mais ce dispositif, un effort a été fait sur un effort a été fait pour pouvoir prendre en compte les jeunes vulnérables. Une orientation, un appui à l'orientation professionnelle est porté au profit des jeunes, mais en l'occurrence au profit des femmes, pour leur permettre de profiter des créneaux porteurs, mais également d'élaborer un plan de développement personnel pour pouvoir profiter des deux chemins qui s'offrent, le chemin de l'emploi salarié et le chemin de l'auto-emploi. Le dispositif met un accent sur la relation avec les structures de microfinance pour permettre aux bénéficiaires de développer une relation financière avec les structures et bénéficier de crédits plus conséquents. L'autre élément mis en exergue par ce dispositif, c'est que les meilleurs entrepreneurs, jeunes entrepreneurs ayant un potentiel sont sélectionnés pour pouvoir bénéficier de services de développement des affaires. Mais quelles sont les actions genre qui sont mises en œuvre dans le cadre du nouveau dispositif? La slide suivante, s'il vous plaît. Cette slide met un accent sur la conservation de la stratégie genre permettant d'assurer la discrimination pour avoir 50% de femmes. Le service de garde d'enfants sera professionnalisé de concert avec le ministère des Affaires sociales. Ensuite, un partenariat sera développé avec les centres de promotion sociale pour pouvoir mieux sensibiliser sur les questions de violence basées sur le genre. Un programme spécial sera développé en faveur de l'apprentissage de 500 jeunes filles dans les métiers porteurs et ces jeunes filles seront sélectionnées parmi les plus pauvres dans le registre social. Le programme de formation sera, sera adapté pour pouvoir tenir compte de la question des ventes à crédit et des stratégies d'embauche. La slide qui suit présente la différenciation faite entre zones urbaines et zones rurales. Au fait, le programme Azoli ne donne pas un package particulier pour les zones rurales par rapport aux zones urbaines, mais un accent est mis sur la sensibilisation dans les zones à risque d'extrémisme violent sur le genre. L'élément important à mettre en exergue, c'est que au niveau des zones urbaines, ils auront un avantage comparatif par rapport à l'accès à la formation. Ces zones, étant donné que ces zones ont meilleur accès à l'information, un meilleur accès à la technologie, étant donné que les enregistrements se feront en ligne et les entreprises d'accueil des jeunes sont basées prioritairement en zone urbaine. Donc, par rapport à ça, les zones urbaines auront un avantage à bénéficier du programme. Par rapport aux avantages, par rapport aux engagements pris par rapport aux zones urbaines, ces engagements sont présentés dans la slide qui suit. Par rapport à ces engagements, de véritables unités de promotion de l'emploi seront mises en place en partenariat avec les communes. Ces communes devront désigner les agents devant assurer l'animation de ces unités et le projet apportera un accompagnement à l'opérationnalisation de ces unités. Il faut dire que sur le projet antérieur, des agents communaux ont été recrutés, mais étant donné que c'est des agents recrutés, à la fin du projet, le service n'a pas été pérennisé. C'est pour ça qu'on met l'accent sur un dispositif interne aux communes pour pouvoir assurer la promotion de l'emploi. Un partenariat sera développé avec chaque commune à travers une convention de partenariat et cette convention définira le cadre de collaboration entre les agents communaux et les conseillers départementaux en emploi de l'ANPE. Il faut dire également qu'un cadre de collaboration sera mis en place entre l'ANPE, les communes et les comités locaux d'insertion et de développement économique pour pouvoir établir des cartes d'opportunités locales à actualiser périodiquement. Merci pour votre attention.
Okay, merci beaucoup, Monsieur Gebessi. Je vais seulement dire que je suis impressionnée par votre résultat qui sont plus que votre target, spécialement les 53% des femmes qui sont vraiment très, très importants. J'ai une question et la question c'est from Iona Botia from World Bank. Could you elaborate on measures to enable young women to enter non-traditional male-dominated sectors, please? We will only take one question and then we will take the other questions at the end of the session. So, seulement ce question-là, s'il vous plaît.
Oui. Merci. Ce qu'on a fait pour les femmes dans le secteur informel, c'est que dans un premier temps, on s'est appesanti sur les femmes qui exercent les métiers de l'artisanat, la couture, la coiffure, mais également, on a mis un accent sur la possibilité pour les femmes d'exercer les métiers traditionnellement exercés par les hommes, à savoir la mécanique, la menuiserie, la menuiserie aluminium, la fonderie. Donc, oui, allô? La menuiserie, donc les métiers traditionnellement exercés par les hommes, on a sensibilisé les femmes pour qu'elles puissent s'inscrire dans ces métiers, bénéficier de formations professionnelles pour avoir accès à ces métiers. Et cela a permis de donner des résultats intéressants. Les femmes se sont intéressées à ces métiers, ont bénéficié de la formation et des kits d'installation ont été apportés pour leur installation. Il faut dire que parmi ces bénéficiaires, beaucoup exercent encore ces métiers et d'autres se sont inscrits en formation professionnelle continue dans ces métiers pour pouvoir assurer leur perfectionnement. L'autre chose, c'est que les femmes ont bénéficié des formations techniques de courte durée dans un certain nombre de métiers ayant rapport à l'artisanat, à l'agriculture, mais également à la restauration et au tourisme, hôtellerie. Je ne sais pas si...
Oui, c'est parfait. Merci beaucoup, monsieur. And now I'd like to pass on to the next presentation. Let me invite our distinguished speaker from Brac, Julie Kedrowski, who's the acting head of technical assistance, Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative, the Brac, who will be presenting on evidence and operational insights from urban graduation programs in Bangladesh and beyond. Julie, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Marvi. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to present evidence and operational insights from Brac's urban graduation programs, both in Bangladesh and globally. I'll start by doing a bit of a review of some of the common characteristics of extreme poverty in urban settings, a bit of a complement to what Pooja had presented initially, but really focusing in on some of the challenges and opportunities that Brac has evaluated and identified and attempted to program for within their projects in urban spaces. The first being the high sort of transient nature of urban poor populations, recognizing rural migration in search of economic opportunities, which I think is addressing one of the questions in the chat, which hopefully we'll get to. The other is around, again, the reliance on informal work, recognizing that 50 to 80% of urban populations engage in the informal sector, be it seasonal or wage labor, domestic service, or even begging. Urban populations are also often concentrated in urban slums, which is an area of work for Brac, including illegal settlements, often resulting in unstable housing situations or a lack of access to stable dwellings. There's also, as Pooja mentioned, limited social cohesion. So we see a high degree of anonymity due to fragmented community networks and social capital lost or lowered during migration. Also, low access to social services, particularly sanitation and solid waste removal, as well as sort of illegal pilfering or tapping of things like electricity or clean water. So often precarious connections, also seeing a lack of access to necessary identification or even just basic information on how to access basic services. There are also some opportunities present in urban contexts that we see, first and foremost, access to more dynamic markets and a willingness to take risks, and also more financial possible gains from enterprises in that context. Also, a benefit, which was spoken about in the presentation previously, was around youth. And oftentimes we find that youth have perhaps higher access to skills-based or training experience or education that can be leveraged in urban graduation programs. So the next slide will talk a bit more about Brac's work in Bangladesh in the urban center, setting some groundwork for what that context looks like. Certainly urban poverty in Bangladesh has been a challenge pre-COVID-19, where roughly 40% of Dhaka's population lived in urban slums, and urban poverty exceeded 20% across the country. This prompted Brac to start the first urban pilot, responding to the growing need of this large population, both individuals and households migrating to urban centers like Dhaka. Building off of the success of the rural graduation program, Brac had launched its first urban pilot in 2010 to better serve people living in extreme poverty in urban contexts and to provide tools and resources to escape the poverty trap. Over the past year and a half, during the peak of COVID-19, the situation in urban centers in Bangladesh became incredibly dire. Lockdowns to control the virus had stalled informal businesses, which we mentioned before is the nexus for economic activity in urban centers. It had also increased food insecurity, and reverse migration from urban centers to rural villages had spiked dramatically. So understanding that context and some of those unique challenges, in 2020, Brac collaborated with another department, so with both the Ultra Poor Graduation Program as well as the Urban Development Program, to strategize a redesign to meet the contextualized needs of people living in extreme poverty in urban settings and facing some of those unique challenges of COVID. This new program, termed the Urban Program Redesign, seeks to address some of those urgent challenges and is now underway. For some context, since that time, since 2020 until now, there have been significant improvements in the situation in urban poverty situations in Bangladesh. This includes the reopening of things like garment factories, schools, small businesses have reopened, and issues around food insecurity have slowed or lessened. But despite improvements, recovery still remains slow and in process, and Brac's hope is that this program will be a vehicle to support that more rapid recovery. To date, the targeting stage, which I know is a key topic to discuss here, is how to target in urban centers. That's been completed for this pilot and includes 6,000 participants from urban centers across Bangladesh, as well as peri-urban centers. We see some major challenges in comparison to rural targeting. So where a more traditional participatory rural appraisal or wealth ranking exercise is not suitable for an urban context, we're having to become more creative around what tools we use to really reach the poorest. So in the redesign program, the targeting process utilized both mean and proxy testing, thinking about per capita income and the $1.90 a day threshold and how it doesn't necessarily translate from a rural context to an urban context. So Brac was able to leverage resources from Brac University to tailor that threshold to really reflect the reality of urban settings in Bangladesh, down to sort of the city level where they're piloting each of these programs. So that's one element. And as is common in Brac programs, they're also in communities conducting focus group discussions and community consultations, and really benefited from the expertise of the Urban Development Program, who's been working in urban contexts in Bangladesh for decades. Some additional selection criteria in terms of proxy means were around age, presence of child labor in the household, as well as educational status of children in the household, among other dimensions. On this slide, we'll look at some of the more unique programmatic elements in comparison to rural graduation programs that Brac is implementing. The first being that program participants self-select a livelihood, such as goat rearing or petty trade, and they're encouraged to diversify, to have a secondary livelihood or income stream that perhaps is able to generate income more quickly or consistently. There are three main pathways, one being strictly business or service and goods related assets, typically those that have previous experience in that space, as well as a combinatory asset, as we're seeing here, with livestock and business, and then the third being strictly livestock related. In this second box here, we're talking a little bit more about the modality of the asset transfer. So typical graduation programs for Brac transfer assets in kind, and we're finding in urban spaces that cash transfers for assets allow for individuals to engage in small trades to better stimulate the local economy and the community quicker, and allow for a greater level of flexibility and sort of entrepreneurial spirit in the dynamic and fast-paced urban market. Also, in terms of operationally, the cash transfer is quicker and often less bureaucratically burdensome for the program, and allows households to start generating and engaging in economic activity much faster. Often see significant delays with in-kind transfers in rural settings. The installment, recognizing that Brac's approach is a big push. The installment it's a larger sum typically, and is provided in 2 installments. The first being the larger of the 2, the second really to encourage either expansion of the initial asset or diversification, with the total enterprise package varying depending on the business. Some additional design elements unique to urban programs center around the life skills and business management coaching. Those are areas specifically related to the challenges of urban life, things like water, sanitation, and hygiene, as well as disaster preparedness for things like floods and fire hazards, evictions, and then financial literacy is a core element as well. Brac's program is also maintaining its support to financial inclusion around savings groups and installments to build that savings behavior for greater resilience, and are looking to really engage where possible, both husbands and wives in co-owning businesses, and really taking the nexus of that coaching element from the household to a business setting, recognizing sort of the mobility within urban settings and how much time is really spent actively engaging in businesses. In terms of the redesign, the cycle for graduation is 1.5 years as opposed to 2 years in rural programs. That's sort of recognizing that urban contexts and urban graduates tend to graduate more quickly. They have more market opportunities, right? They're able to grow and build their incomes more quickly, as well as the feasibility and of the cash disbursements. They're able to start actively engaging and saving and investing much faster. Another unique element, which I think really speaks to some of the challenges we're seeing globally, is that Brac has worked with the German Development Bank, KfW, to integrate a climate resilience element into the urban program, really serving urban populations and targeting climate migrants in particular, and providing specialized life skills training, providing additional supports around food security, trying to really better understand those unique challenges of urban climate migrants. So that's the Bangladesh experience, and now we'll talk a bit about how we're taking lessons learned from that approach and applying them globally through UPGI's work in different geographies. So as typical across our Brac programs, it's the foundation behind our programs is the graduation pillars, the 4 pillars of livelihoods promotion, social protection, financial inclusion, and social empowerment. And these are all inextricably linked and work together to respond to multidimensional needs of urban and extreme poor populations and provide an upward trajectory towards sustainable livelihoods and resilience. In terms of how they're adapted, we have some examples of what those design elements look like in urban settings as opposed to rural. And so in terms of livelihoods promotion, again, recognizing a heavy dependence on daily wage labor and unskilled or low skilled labor, we're looking to provide, again, an asset transfer typically in cash, but also advising on vocational training and wage employment pathways, thinking about the broader diversity of opportunities that are present in that space. We're also maintaining and encouraging localized market assessments, often engaging with employers and vendors in consultation to better understand short-term and medium-term employment opportunities in the formal space. And then technical and business management training, we're finding a need to tier that to segmented groups of urban poor, recognizing the heterogeneity and mix of skills, resources, talents and interests of that group, and really needing to meet people where they are in order to allow for that kind of growth. In terms of social protection, this was also touched on throughout the presentations, really an access to basic services, and there's limited visibility on some of those services. So for us, really encouraging linkages where possible and advocating for the horizontal expansion of social protection schemes that often are not present in urban settings or really struggle to sufficiently target the right population in extreme poverty. As mentioned before, focusing on reliable sanitation and hygiene services, and where possible, provision of stable and secure housing. In terms of financial inclusion or means of growing an income and preparing for shocks, in urban settings, Brac is seeing a high rate of indebtedness due to the relatively high cost of living in urban centers. And while there are formal and informal financial institutions and savings mechanisms, we find that they're often underutilized or have barriers to entry for urban poor. Those include things like proper identification or collateral or a fixed address in order to enroll. So for Brac, focusing on financial literacy training, really around how to engage in more dynamic market spaces, how to diversify and expand income generating assets, maintaining a focus as in the Bangladesh program on linkages or creations of savings groups in order to build that level of resilience. And then the urban space also offers greater access to individual bank accounts, which is facilitated through the coaching element, as well as digital banking mechanisms, which can be quite useful in that space. And in terms of social empowerment, recognizing the transient nature of this community and the lack of social ties and cohesion, our inputs are really centered around community mobilization, making sure that we're bringing individuals together and trying to form some kinds of self-governing structures or platforms that allow for them to increase agency, voice, and visibility within their communities, but most especially with local authorities in order to advocate for better service provision. Some additional avenues are also around group-based coaching in order to sort of knit together some of those peer groups and strengthen social capital in these communities. And I'll touch briefly on what this looks like in some of our global portfolio. So in terms of the livelihoods promotion, in both Uganda and in India, Brac has identified more skills-based vocational training. Examples include electrical work, mobile repair, motorcycle repair, hospitality, things of that nature that are targeted towards urban and peri-urban women and youth in particular, as well as more ambulatory petty trade options that allow for greater mobility. In terms of social protection, we're working with the Asian Development Bank and the Tamil Nadu Slum and Clearance Board to influence the design of infrastructure that increases access to sanitation services to improve poor health and hygiene for urban poor populations. This is in particular the context of a resettlement project, which we'll talk about in the next slide as well. In the Philippines, we're working again with our partners at the Asian Development Bank and with the government of the Philippines, and have partnered with local financial service providers to ensure financial literacy and training, really tailored to those needs of urban poor, specifically around how to spot predatory lending and how to increase access or steady access to micro savings to really impact and lessen the rate of indebtedness. And overall, the goal of all Brac programs is really to improve household budgeting, financial management, and to build savings behavior. In this case in particular, really moving the needle on indebtedness. And then across our portfolio, again, working to strengthen social capital and government accountability, direct one-on-one coaching, social and health messaging, and then also really getting communities in front of local municipal administrations and being able to create space for voice and agency.
Jody, can we kind of hurry up because we're
Sure.
running a bit out of time. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I'll touch briefly on the Tamil Nadu project. I think it's really an interesting analogy thinking about rural to urban migration and what's lost in that transition, and how Brac is really trying to provide for some of those things like economic opportunities and social capital. In the Tamalado context of resettlement, we're finding similar deprivations as individuals are being relocated due to hazards like flooding, and how we're working to build that, but also a unique element of being able to really influence the physical structure of resettlement sites in order to encourage economic activity and social cohesion. So I think it's something that Judy is likely to touch on in her presentation as well. And we talked a bit about sort of thinking about these design elements and the impacts of COVID-19 and how we've had to adjust some of our programming. So I'll touch on a couple of examples, really encouraging limiting one-on-one contact and encouraging social distancing. So hosting group coaching activities, as well as mobilizing mobile phones and SMS to provide some training during quarantine sessions, really trying to provide some additional advice on how to continue to operate livelihoods during quarantine, or how to adjust or shift, or perhaps even market differently as a result of COVID. We're providing information in the life skills training around COVID information, things like hygiene, hand washing, mask usage, as well as how to avoid misinformation around the virus from online sources. And overall, looking to increase diversification for livelihoods in order to protect against some of those shocks and inevitable sort of lockdowns or guidelines restrictions related to COVID-19. And the last slide I have here is just some overall sort of summary reflections on some of the key challenges and opportunities of operating in an urban context, thinking about government integration, how leveraging existing government programs, we see this in our work in Bangladesh as well as in Tamalado in the Philippines. A lot of the core pieces are there. It's about layering, sequencing, and strengthening government capacity to really engage with households more intensely. Also opportunities to work with more non-traditional partners. Our traditional partners are ministries of social welfare and development, of women and children, but opportunities to work with departments of housing and urban development, labor and employment, those that can really directly influence service provision and infrastructure. We touched a lot on the livelihoods piece. I'm happy to answer questions on how we're sort of reframing that. But I think the partnerships piece here is really unique around possibilities to partner with private sector, as well as skills training institutes and financial inclusion providers, and to really tailor those products to the urban poor. And then,
okay, thank you very much, Judy. That's great. Thanks a lot. I think I just want to say that your 4 pillars: livelihood, financial inclusion, social protection, social empowerment, that makes a lot of sense. We just have one quick question. If you were to name one, literally just one, critical mistake that you need to avoid for those who are starting to design and implement programs on the urban side, what would be that one element that you would touch on?
I think the livelihoods piece, right? A localized market assessment. Urban markets, while providing so many opportunities, are quite unique and rapidly changing. So making sure that you're providing a localized market assessment and refinements to that process as you go along is really critical.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Julie. I'd now like to move to the final country presentation by the distinguished Monsieur Abdurrahman Ali Ahmad, Directeur Général de l'Agence de la Réhabilitation Urbaine et du Logement Social de Djibouti, on evidence and operational insights from an urban development program with an economic inclusion component in Djibouti. Over to you, Monsieur.
Je vais rapidement commencer la présentation. Alors, avant tout, d'abord, je me présente, je m'appelle Abdurrahman Ali Ahmed et je suis le directeur général de l'Agence de réhabilitation urbaine et du logement social. Et l'agence étant un établissement public, alors, l'agence étant un établissement public qui est le bras armé de la politique du logement sous le ministère de la Ville, de l'Urbanisme et de l'Habitat. Et bien entendu, aujourd'hui, nous avons eu l'opportunité, à travers ce webinaire, de présenter un peu le programme urbain que nous menons actuellement et qui est sous l'appellation du programme Zéro bidonville. Comme vous le savez, dans beaucoup de pays africains, à l'instar des pays africains, nous sommes en train de traiter la question du bidonville et chaque pays traite cette question du bidonville suivant un contexte qui est particulier à lui. Et dans le cadre de notre pays, les bidonvilles sont souvent caractérisés par des quartiers qui sont souvent sous-équipés, avec des voiries qui ne sont pas parfois aux normes, le réseau de connexions d'électricité, de voirie et d'eau potable qui sont extrêmement faibles, et bien entendu un taux de chômage qui est élevé, et surtout une régularisation, c'est-à-dire une régulation foncière qui est extrêmement faible parce que beaucoup de ces personnes, de ces familles qui habitent dans le bidonville ne sont pas propriétaires de leur logement. C'est dans ce cadre-là que le président de la République a réfléchi à initier un programme qu'on appelle un programme Zéro bidonville et qui consiste en quelque sorte à aborder le problème complexe des bidonvilles en adoptant une manière systématique et globale, en adoptant une nouvelle approche institutionnelle, en clarifiant les priorités et les principes de déploiement des investissements et en créant une plateforme pour les investissements sectoriels. Donc, chose qui est rare, c'est vraiment de permettre à ce que le programme Zéro bidonville soit l'assiette pour pouvoir mener les opérations urbaines, tout en essayant de capitaliser les investissements qui viennent d'autres secteurs pour que le quartier sur lequel nous investissons ou nous travaillons dessus puisse avoir les meilleures conditions de vie et d'habitat. Et dans ce sens-là, nous avons réfléchi sur une stratégie de mise en œuvre du programme qui est axée sur 3 axes, comme vous le voyez. Il y a l'axe qu'on parle sur tout ce qui touche à la prévention et le relogement des ménages. C'est un axe important, c'est l'axe numéro 1. Pourquoi? Parce que le temps que nous travaillons sur les bidonvilles, nous ne voulons pas qu'il y ait d'autres bidonvilles qui se créent. Et pour ça, nous avons mis en œuvre, nous sommes en train de préparer des terrains viabilisés où il y aura les écoles, les routes, des nouvelles cités pour pouvoir permettre de répondre à la demande de parcelles sociales afin d'arrêter la prolifération des bidonvilles, mais surtout permettre de reloger les familles qui seront déplacées des opérations de l'axe numéro 2 qui concerne la restructuration des quartiers bidonvillaires elles-mêmes. Et une fois qu'on a listé environ 13 quartiers sur tout Djibouti qui verront ce programme Zéro bidonville qui va, je dirais de manière globale, essayer d'améliorer les conditions de vie et d'habitat de ce quartier. En réfléchissant à cette stratégie, nous avons également compris qu'il est inutile de ne pas agir sur l'habitat lui-même, sur les personnes, parce que si demain nous faisons uniquement la réhabilitation des quartiers précaires et que nous laissons les quartiers, les logements extrêmement précaires, ces logements seront, je dirais, subiront tout ce qui est les effets des changements climatiques. Et c'est pour ça que nous avons réfléchi à l'axe numéro 3 qui est l'amélioration de la qualité du logement. À travers la mise en œuvre de ce programme, bien entendu, il y a tout ce qui touche à l'inclusion économique qui va nous permettre de créer des emplois pour les quartiers et pour les zones à réaménager et surtout mettre en place ce qu'on appelle une forte ingénierie sociale. Alors, nous avons identifié 13 quartiers qui sont un peu réparpillés dans la ville de Djibouti, 3 qui se trouvent dans la commune de Boulaos, un peu plus au nord, et 10 qui se trouvent dans la commune de Balbala, qui est un peu plus au sud. Et dans un des quartiers, c'est là où le projet intégré de résolution de bidonville, qui est financé par la Banque mondiale, une fois que la stratégie a été mise en place, la Banque mondiale a été la première à dire « nous nous lançons » avec un premier financement qui va permettre de restructurer le premier quartier qui concerne et qui s'appelle le quartier de Balbala ancien. Bien entendu, les autres quartiers, nous sommes en train de travailler sur les études techniques et nous avons déjà beaucoup de partenaires, notamment la Banque islamique, l'AFD, la BAD, qui commencent à s'intéresser au programme parce qu'ils ont vu qu'il y avait une entente holistique, une approche un peu plus globale de la réponse qu'on souhaite donner à l'amélioration des conditions de vie de nos concitoyens. Alors, dans le quartier identifié pour le programme, c'est-à-dire le programme intégré de résolution de bidonville, financé par la banque, nous essayons d'améliorer ce quartier-là que vous voyez, avec bien entendu l'ouverture des voiries et l'amener de tout ce qui touche à l'adduction d'eau potable, les réseaux électriques et surtout la construction des équipements publics tels qu'une école un poste de santé, un centre de développement communautaire et des terrains de sport pour les jeunes. Donc, le plan de restauration a été déjà élaboré et bien entendu, dans ce contexte-là, Marvi, est-ce que vous pouvez, je ne sais pas.
Oui, je peux voir votre slide, mais après ça, tout, oui, voilà, c'est ça?
C'est blanc?
C'est blanc.
Alors, est-ce que Claudia peut-être peut partager? Je ne sais pas. Qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Oui, Claudia, can you partage, s'il vous plaît? On a perdu après le dernier slide. Mais je voulais à ce point-là dire que votre collaboration avec les habitants de Balbala ancien, c'est très important parce que ça nous donne quelque chose qui est très intégré dans la société. Et ça, c'est important.
Exactement, parce que ça permet de ce qu'on appelle de mettre en place l'appropriation du projet. Oui. Nous ne voulons pas seulement imposer des voiries, nous ne voulons pas seulement faire des opérations de restauration, mais également travailler avec ces familles-là pour qu'eux-mêmes, ils repensent comment le quartier va se développer avec eux.
Oui. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire un peu plus sur le Community Development Fund? Parce que le slide, on le voit pas, mais à ce point-là, si vous pouvez parler à propos de Community Investment and Development Fund. Ça, c'est très intéressant parce que les autres pays le font aussi. Et moi aussi, je l'ai fait quand j'étais ministre au Pakistan.
Alors, effectivement, il y a différents aspects que nous sommes en train de mener. Il y a l'aspect sur le fonds de développement. Attendez, je vais peut-être, je ne sais pas, partager la version française.
Pas de problème, pas de problème.
Voilà, je pense qu'on aura les images qui vont venir.
Oui, et maintenant, on est sur slide numéro.
Excellent. Donc, je pense que, voilà. Alors, on était ici, donc effectivement, à travers, je pense que vous voyez, c'est ça?
Oui, on le voit, merci.
Excellent. Alors, à ce niveau-là, l'objectif du PIRB, c'est effectivement de cibler les investissements en faveur de populations. Comme vous l'avez dit, il y a également la mise en place des guichets, la mise en place d'un fonds de développement communautaire. Nous l'avons renommé en fonds d'investissement et développement communautaire, justement pour toucher cette dynamique d'inclusion économique. On ne veut pas rester uniquement sur le social, mais aller plus loin sur tout ce qui est investissement pour permettre à ces populations-là de mettre en œuvre des activités économiques qui peuvent leur servir à générer des revenus, mais également à entretenir les équipements publics. Donc, dans la réalisation justement de ce programme, il y a tout ce qui touche à l'activité IMO, donc il y a deux volets. Il y a d'abord tout ce qui touche toutes les opérations physiques que nous menons dans le quartier. Nous recrutons systématiquement les jeunes du quartier, notamment en mettant en place des activités qu'on appelle activités IMO. Dans ce cadre-là, nous avons pu recruter 500 jeunes qui ont permis de faire les voiries. Et l'activité qu'on préconise, c'est tout ce qui touche à la pierre taillée. Donc, on met les voiries, toute cette voirie qu'on réalise, c'est en pierre taillée et ça favorise tout ce qui est création d'emplois. Tous ces jeunes-là ont été recrutés et une fois fini, on voit que la voirie est vraiment très spacieuse avec, bien entendu, les trottoirs qui sont faits. Deuxième action, c'est effectivement tout ce qui touche. Lorsqu'on prépare la voie, il y a des maisons qui sont touchées et qu'on doit faire ce qu'on appelle des opérations de recul de façade. Une fois que le recul de façade est activé, on voit que nous essayons de reconstruire leur façade en dur pour qu'au moins ils bénéficient de ce qu'on appelle des logements en dur et qu'ils soient résilients face au changement climatique. Donc, il y a pas mal de projets qu'on a réalisés. On a effectivement les logements précaires qui deviennent en dur et ça a permis de recruter également 200 jeunes dans les opérations de reconstruction de ces maisons-là. Bien entendu, à la fin, ce que nous souhaitons, c'est que nous avons également mis en place ce qu'on appelle un fonds de développement, un fonds d'investissement et développement communautaire. Le fonds d'investissement va permettre de scénarios. Premier scénario, c'est de permettre à toutes les personnes ou toutes les petites activités informelles qui sont dans le quartier de se formaliser à travers ce fonds-là. Nous avons par exemple des femmes qui ont des petites sociétés de couture qu'on souhaiterait peut-être les formaliser pour qu'ils aient au moins une enceinte pour pouvoir formaliser leur emploi. Il y a souvent dans ces quartiers-là des outils, des garages, des garagistes qui réparent les véhicules. On va les formaliser pour que demain, ils aient une activité formelle. Sur l'autre aspect du fonds de développement communautaire, c'est tout ce qui touche à l'entretien des équipements et à la formation des jeunes dans ce quartier-là. Il y a des associations qui se trouvent dans ce quartier qui vont soumettre des projets d'entretien des voiries, de plantation d'arbres, parce qu'il faut également combattre le réchauffement climatique. Nous avons créé ce qu'on appelle des aires de jeu. Ces aires de jeu, on doit les maintenir, donc les associations vont les maintenir. Il y a des fonds qu'on a créés avec eux qui vont réfléchir à pérenniser leur activité qu'ils vont mener. Et souvent, et fréquemment, ce que nous souhaitons mettre en œuvre, c'est tout ce qu'on appelle l'innovation. On veut également que les jeunes innovent en mettant en place ce qu'ils appellent des activités numériques, donc la formation des ordinateurs, donc tout ce qui touche aux ordinateurs, aux formations du numérique et pas mal d'autres activités qui peuvent leur permettre d'asseoir l'employabilité et la qualification, et je dirais une formation qualifiante qui demain va leur permettre d'avoir un emploi dans les secteurs privés et dans d'autres secteurs. Donc, principalement, ce fonds-là, nous l'avions initialement en fonds de développement communautaire, nous l'avons agrandi et on l'a mis en place ce qu'on appelle un fonds d'investissement et développement communautaire. Donc voilà principalement ce que je voulais dire, bien que peut-être l'ancien document est un peu plus résumé.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Oui, je vous écoute.
Attendez. Maintenant, est-ce que vous pouvez m'entendre?
Oui, je vous entends. Oui.
D'accord. Alors, la question, c'est how the skills of beneficiaries have been strengthened in relation to the stonemasonry work trades and how the development of life skills and entrepreneurship aspects have been taken into account. On n'a pas beaucoup de temps, alors vous avez seulement une minute.
Alors, ces voiries-là, souvent, on lance un appel d'offres, donc on recrute une entreprise contractante qui a les capacités et les formations adéquates, et nous recrutons les jeunes du quartier qui sont formés sur l'État. Généralement, la difficulté, c'est que souvent, avec la banque, on perd un peu le délai, parce que le délai est assez lent pour la raison de ces activités, mais souvent, c'est pour le bien des jeunes, parce qu'ils sont formés sur l'État. On les apprend comment poser la pierre, parce que nous avons environ 13 km de voirie à faire, et sur ces 13 km, nous avons environ 10 km de voirie qu'on va le faire en pierre taillée. Donc, vous savez, ces jeunes-là vont également eux-mêmes, demain, former d'autres jeunes dans le quartier, et au fur et à mesure, ça va leur permettre non seulement d'être formés dans tout ce qui dans le développement de pierre taillée, dans la pose de pierre taillée, mais également, ça va leur permettre d'avoir un revenu mensuel qui va leur permettre de subvenir à leurs besoins.
D'accord, merci beaucoup, monsieur. And now I'd like to announce the final speaker for today, as discussant, who's quite an authority on the subject, no doubt, Judy Baker, who's the global lead for urban poverty, inclusive cities and housing from the World Bank. Over to you, Judy.
Thank you so much. It's really delightful to be here, and thanks to the speakers for the excellent presentations. They were really rich, and it was very nice to see how different countries and different sectors are addressing this perspective. So just to give you a tiny bit of context, so I have been working on issues of urban poverty in the World Bank from many different angles throughout my career. And at some point, I was working on an urban upgrading program in Brazil, where we had a fairly large component that was focused on economic inclusion. And we had training. And so in addition to the physical infrastructure, we had some of the social and economic interventions, especially targeted at youth and women. And I have to say, I learned so much from that program. And since then, I would say that it's been a really helpful perspective to think about how we develop our programs, especially targeting the urban poor. So just today, I'm just going to give you a few highlighted reflections, no PowerPoint. So to start, we heard a lot about the challenges that cities face of unemployment, slums. We also know from our own personal experiences of being in many cities in developing countries about congestion, pollution, crime and violence, and now, of course, the impacts of climate change. But I actually want to flip that because I think it's important to remember that cities also bring lots of opportunities, especially from a jobs perspective. So, you know, the agglomeration of people and assets brings together a lot of dynamism. There's opportunities for efficiency, for innovation, for higher productivity. And I think when we're designing these programs and thinking about how to enter into the space of economic inclusion in cities, we really need to remember that and try to leverage those strong assets that you might find in cities. So I wanted to just touch a little bit on a couple of the country presentations. So Secretary Wilfred from Benin presented you know, a really interesting perspective that, first of all, builds on an impact evaluation that that they're going to be doing that will help to build our knowledge on what works and what doesn't. And I think that's an incredibly helpful you know, addition to the knowledge base for programs, not only for Benin, but for other programs going forward. It was excellent to really see this focus on young women and really interesting approach in setting up a labor market information system at the local level with local governments. And I think, again, we'll be really interested to see how that follows through. I'm also very intrigued by these local employment promotion units and how they will work in practice and what the relationship is with other aspects of the project and also with other local government agencies. And Julie's presentation on Brac was also really interesting for me. I worked on DACA, on urban poverty many years ago, and it was actually before they had urban programs. And I remember having discussions with Brac at the time, you know, why wouldn't you enter into urban areas with some of your programs, because the need is there. And I think there were a lot of concerns that came out in some of the presentations about, you know, the population is very transient. How do you target? There were a lot of challenges. So obviously, you know, Brac has come a long way. I love the holistic approach that really can sustain some of the impacts. So it's not just one aspect of economic inclusion, but really a much more holistic approach where you've tried to understand the dynamics of the urban poor and address them, you know, with a careful acknowledgement of the many facets that challenges and opportunities that people face in cities. And then I was also excited to hear about the ability to link with government agencies and some of the non-traditional partners. And I'll come back to them, one of my final points. And then Director Ahmed, I was very excited to hear about Djibouti. So this is a project that I've been introduced to before. I've met some of your colleagues when they've come to Washington, and I work, you know, with the team from the bank that, you know, has been implementing and supporting the government on this project. And again, there, I think the focus on youth is on the economic inclusion piece is, you know, very well targeted to, you know, a vulnerable population. you know, this is, it's an upgrading project, which is, you know, some of, you know, a little bit more of what we do in the urban sector. But, you know, you were again, a little bit like the Brazil project, able to bring in this economic inclusion piece and work with, you know, labor intensive works. And this has been a tool that's really, really helpful, especially during COVID, as we try to, you know, help people with some of the economic impacts that they've had and get to work. So we've been scrambling with a lot of our projects, and this is one that has really already been doing that. And I also really love the community consultation piece of it. I think it adds a lot of value. So looking ahead, you know, just a couple things I wanted to highlight. So first of all is that, you know, this approach to addressing the urban poor, you know, we have people working on urban projects, we have people working on economic inclusion, and many other sectors as well that work in this space. But it's, I think, a real opportunity to bring together some of the different aspects of inclusion for the urban poor. So we have a framework that we've developed that includes not only economic inclusion, but also spatial inclusion. So that would be related to aspects specifically around housing, services, and some of the connectivity, both within cities and outside of cities. And then social inclusion. So that's also about bringing in some of the vulnerable groups, some people that don't have voice, and making sure that they also are able to participate in the opportunities that cities bring. I would just leave you with 3 points, some food for thought. So the first one is, sorry, I've got my paper here. Okay. Things that I didn't hear so much about, but I think there are still some unanswered questions that, you know, maybe we want to talk about or go forward with additional work. So, you know, a lot of these programs are, you know, still for people working in the informal sector. But we know when shocks like COVID or other kinds of shocks hit, these people have no safety nets at all to fall back on. So I think, you know, a future phase of this is really to think about how do we formalize a little bit some of what's happening in the informal sector so that, you know, when the shocks hit, as you're building livelihoods, there will be a way also to build up that safety net. A second area is this matching of jobs and people. So one of the things, again, in many of the interviews that I've done with urban poor is that they really don't have the social networks to go out and get jobs. So, which, you know, is really important. So how can we build up this, you know, notion of, you know, supply and demand of labor with the informal workers, especially with people that don't have the networks for connections. So I'm wondering, again, we heard about a little bit of that in the Benin project. I'm wondering how we could scale that up. And then finally, the most important point I want to leave you with is how to work with local governments. So like anything, you know, the challenges of coordination are huge. So we talked about working with traditional actors and non-traditional actors, but this is a piece that, you know, the more I work on these areas, the more difficult I find it is to you know, get this, you know, figure this last piece out. You know, how can we foster good collaboration and team building and a collaborative approach that tackles these issues in a holistic way? And, you know, there are lots of good experiences, but then it's always about institutionalizing them and sustaining them. And this is you know, a final area that I just wanted to leave you with that thought, and hope that in the projects that you all work on, there would be opportunities to do that and learn from those experiences. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. Really appreciate that. It was perfect. I just have, in fact, j'aimerais bien remercier Monsieur Ahmed qui a déjà répondu sur les questions dans le groupe, dans le chat. So we have just one or two questions left, really. One is from Dan Norrell. How effective is business training for self-employment for youth? What is the research finding? And maybe Brac can answer that very quickly, or Benin.
I'm so sorry, I didn't get the question. If you could perhaps repeat it.
How effective is business training for self-employment for youth? What is the research finding? Impact assessments, perhaps?
So Brac's youth programs and urban programs have not targeted youth very specifically. We've gotten one pilot in Uganda with some strong results, but it's certainly an area that we're hoping to grow the evidence base, particularly for Brac, and thinking about really the interests of youth in that space. I think that we've struggled to find sometimes the right entry points for youth in formal employment or in informal employment. What's exciting and sustainable for youth is different in different contexts. So that's still certainly plenty of work to be done on that in an area of strategic growth for us at Brac. But curious to hear from our colleague in Benin.
Monsieur de Benin, est-ce que vous allez dire quelque chose sur le point de youth, peut-être? Bon, d'accord. Okay, I'm now going to try and summarize. I think Judy's done a fantastic job, so I'm not going to repeat that. I just wanted to congratulate the Partnership for Economic Inclusion and the Brac team. It's been an incredible open house. Let me take this opportunity to just give you a few priorities the way I see them. Number one, I think we've perhaps not really focused on this much today, but the COP26 commitments on cities must be evaluated from an economic inclusion perspective. And I'm sure our teams will be doing that when the time comes. There's some specific recommendations that have come up. We must hold them on that. And we must be part of the process. Number two, migration and conflict leading to more urban resettlement. It has definitely created a huge load. We see that on a daily basis. On the existing cities. This, of course, in terms of urban planning and urban poverty, must be adequately managed. This is something that all of us, whoever's in this as stakeholders, we must be zooming in on specifically. Number three, corporate social responsibility. That is something that perhaps we didn't touch on so much today, but I feel that in my experience, when we had state programs, and all the emphasis is either on IFIs, state multilateral organizations, the state, the government, but when you merge that with corporate social responsibility, and when you merge that with corporates, you create a force multiplier. So I think specifically for the urban question as well, how to improve economic inclusion on the urban side, they'll be more than happy to take that up. I have specific examples from my own country when I was when I was minister there, but I don't want to get into that because we don't have much time for that. And number four, gender sensitization, which some of the presentations I'm so happy to see touched on gender sensitization throughout economic inclusion, especially in what we call the urban jungle as such, for the safety and security must be kept as a top priority. And now some conclusions very quickly. Urban centers have markets and jobs, but urban poor lack skills. They lack social networks to access to finance, to start small businesses, or even access wage jobs. Number two, standalone interventions, as we have seen from the presentations, can't help in entirety. Thus, what we talk about in terms of economic inclusion, the package of support to address multiple types of constraints is required. And I'm glad that that has come up today in today's discussion. Number three, embedding economic inclusion programs in city level planning ensures one can combine place and people interventions. We've talked about that today as well. So a very close coordination between different levels of government This I speak from personal experience as well, because there's obviously a different, even when you talk about the urban side, there's different stakeholders. It's perhaps the federal level, the provincial level, the mayor level, the city level, etc. But you also have a lot of stakeholders. So that must be kept. And the key lesson, which I believe that we must zoom in on, which we tried to, and we did to some extent, is that urban and rural programs must be designed differently. It's as simple as that. They cannot be transplanted because you will not get the right results. So I think those are the conclusions that I would like to leave you with. I now have some final housekeeping points before we close. PEI's next open house, I'm happy to announce, will be happening in early December, and will focus on the conversation around the cost analysis and cost optimization of economic inclusion programs. Please also help us improve by filling out our quick feedback on this session. The survey questions are coming up on the screen now, I hope, Claudia. And also do not forget to review a very important publication, which will be public shortly. I believe I can give the name of the publication. It's called, and you did refer to it, it's A Path to Jobs for the Urban Poor. It's going to be on the PEI website. It will be a superb follow-up for today's webinar. A lot of it has been taken from there. Before I close the webinar for today, I would encourage all participants to check the PEI website for future follow-ups, and to follow PEI on Twitter, and to obviously keep the conversation going. The poll is right there. I'd like to thank everyone for today's participation. It has been an absolute honor and a privilege to have moderated this session. A very big thank you to all the, not just the participants, but especially the organizers of today's event. Thank you very much, and we'd like to close today. Take care. Bye-bye.